Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather and talk about your word. Help your word inspire us to be better servants and help us to understand the challenges that Paul had in his day and the challenges we have today. We ask this in your name. Amen. Now, one of the assignments Dave gave me was to talk about worship back in the day. He asked about that, and I've been searching and searching and searching. And it turns out that the original church had a different view of the world because there were no clergy. In fact, that was the basis of your question. What did they do without clergy? Well, basically what Paul's view was, and this is from John Drain, basically what was going on is Paul wanted the church to be a place that everybody participated in. So he talked about using the body all the time and how everybody fits into it. Well, he felt that worship should be sort of the same way. And as a result, the early church was a singing church. And everybody sang a lot. And you know, the original purpose of the Psalms was that they were sung either on the way to worship or during worship. So, John Drain points this out. He says, in Paul's understanding of the church and its operation, everyone has a part to play. When Christians meet together for worship and fellowship, they all have something to offer and must be given the opportunity to do so. That was Paul's view. This is the opposite of what actually happened throughout most of the history of the Christian church. The traditional church structures have generally allowed participation only by a minority, the priest or lay leaders or someone, while the majority have either been expected to be silent spectators or occasionally allowed to join in the specific invitation under strict control of leadership. I hope I don't do that. This was not Paul's expectation at all, for every Christian was empowered by the Holy Spirit, and if the church was the sphere in which God's Spirit was working to demonstrate the reality of God's kingdom, then it was only logical to suppose that all Christians should have their part to play in the life of the church. As a result, Paul asserts that every Christian has their own distinctive charism, which is where the word charisma comes from. A ministry that is not restricted by either ordination or some other special experience, which is given to all by the work of the Spirit in the lives of the believers. Now, way back in when, we Presbyterians believe that. We believe in the priesthood of all believers. So, we're pretty well in line with what Paul had in mind. So basically what Paul was saying is that all members are equal. John Drain says, though individual Christians are not identical in either personality or ability, all of you are of equal importance. Through some, such as those who speak in tongues or those who teach, they might seem more important, but they are not. And if some wish to have other functions than those God has given them, they should remember that they can only receive what the Spirit gives them. Any attempt to try to attain particular gifts for themselves will only lead to the destruction of the whole church, presumably because such activity would undermine the basis of mutual trust and respect on which real spiritual freedom is based. So in other words, what the original church was is they would get together and they would share and they would sing, and whoever had a mind would speak that day. Now, as clergy came along, we kind of got away from that, and also because the fact is that most people don't like speaking in groups anyway, unless it's a group that they're very, very familiar with, like a Bible study, for instance. So that's the way it originally was. Now, because of that, some things got out of line, and Paul would have to write letters to straighten it out. For example, the Eucharist. The Eucharist is a very somber, the communion is a very somber thing. We know that. We've always treated it that way. Well, some of the original churches thought that this was a reason to have a party. And they did. And the Eucharist was part of this big feast and dancing and everything, and Paul had to straighten that one out. Okay, because Because remember, there was nobody else that knew the rule, because there were no rules. So that's how it got going. And also it points out in the book here that a lot of churches would worship in hidden places and caverns and things. And the other part of the early church was, it was an artistic church. So if you go down in those caverns today, you'll see the remnants of murals that people painted and things like that, which is the predecessor to stained glass. So you had a lot of singing, a lot of expression, a lot of artwork, a lot of those kinds of things in the original church. Like I say, the disadvantage was, Paul was only one person. So all he could do was take into account what other people were telling him was going on. And then he would react one way or the other and send a letter back saying, this is the way you really ought to do it. Okay?
I have two questions. Could women found the church, so to speak, you know, the ones that have been following Paul, and it says that women are supposed to speak in church.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the case, how can they found the church? You know, is it all just because of like what they do in the family as a mother, or what?
Well,
It seems contradictory, kind of.
well, remember, Paul was always criticized because he didn't like women, but that's not far from the truth. Remember, when you read the stories, he keeps talking about all of these women that helped him out. Remember, Timothy's mother and grandmother, he mentions by name as being leaders of the church. And the lady who did the dyeing, the purple dye, was a leader in the church. Paul didn't care if you were male or female. He just wanted people that were willing to grow the body.
Okay.
Now, where that got confused along the line, I don't know. I can't honestly answer that. But in the original church, everybody participated. Male, female, slave, free, didn't make any difference. In fact, it was not all that uncommon for the master and some of the slaves that worked for him to be in the same church. So, the answer, that was Paul's view of it. Now, whether, where it got, sort of, perverted over the years, I can't answer that. But I can tell you that in the original church, they were pretty much allowed. Now, in the Jewish church, that was not the case. In the synagogue, the women basically couldn't say much of anything. They just sat there.
It was just men, right?
Yeah, it was just men.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought something that we had read, it talked about, the proper code for people in the church. Like the women had to cover their heads, and they couldn't have short hair, and they weren't supposed to talk in church. And
Well, not in Paul's church, okay? Paul's church, he wanted them to talk. Now, they did have to cover their heads, but then again, the men had rules too. And, so there were rules on both sides. In fact, the Jewish church, the men had to wear certain garments in order to be admitted to the synagogue. So there was all kinds of rules going around, and that's what Paul did. He threw out a lot of these rules. That's why everybody was after him. I mean, look at today. The Presbyterian Church allows women to be ordained as ministers. You never get away with that in the Baptist Church. We're close to what Paul saw the body as being. Okay, and his like I just read, as long as if you had the skill and the spirit, he didn't care who you were. But what the book was also telling you is, unfortunately, in the early church, some people tended to value certain gifts more than others. And they were trying to mimic like they had them, and they didn't. For some reason, speaking in tongues was considered a very, very high spiritual gift at that time. But, either you spoke in tongues or you babbled. So a lot of people started babbling, okay? Because that's what speaking in tongues was, and that was important. So I'm going to speak in tongues like everybody else. And it reminds me of there was a television show about young Indiana Jones. And he was going to the University of Chicago at the time. And by the way, Elliot Ness was his roommate, of course. So, but he somehow got involved with a jazz group. And he played a little bit of saxophone. So he started playing improv, and the guy says, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm doing what you're doing." "No, you're not." So what he made him do is he made him learn how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He says, "When you play that, then we'll talk." And then from there, he taught him how to do improv. So basically, that's what was going on in the early church. A whole lot of people were doing what Indiana Jones was doing. I'm doing what they're doing, without understanding what it was.
Now, during these early services, you said that there was a lot of discussion.
Right.
Okay, then there had to have been a lot of questions.
Yes, there were.
Why do we have to do this? Why are you telling us to do this and that?
No, that's why Paul wrote his letters. If you read, when we read Paul's letters, you'll see he gives instructions like that. And then the letters are brought back and then shared with all of the churches in an area, and now they understand, okay? You see, that's the thing. Paul and a few others were the only ones that knew anything. So what would happen is they would have to step in, as Paul did this a lot, and correct things. And also congratulate people for doing the right things. He did both. Well, anyway, so move on to what Paul was doing. The last week it looked like we were headed towards the end, but unfortunately, the book of Acts ends before the story is over. So I found this so we could talk about what happened to Paul in the last days. Would somebody like to read that first paragraph, starting at Paul's first imprisonment and then going to section 10:3? No, just read it from the paper. Read it from the paper in front of you, Dave.
Oh, I see.
Anybody can step forward.
I'll do it. Paul was under house arrest in Rome. Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. But within these constraints, he is free to conduct his ministry in person and by letter. The book of Acts concludes, "For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. Boldly and without hindrance, he preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. For these 2 years, he is chained to a Roman guard, one of several who rotate through shifts. As a result, over time, many soldiers were converted. The Philippians was written during Paul's Roman imprisonment, as I think likely. Then he not only had a letter-writing ministry, but also a personal ministry to those around him. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. But in spite of the inconvenience of being chained to a guard, Paul carried on a rather active ministry with many people coming and going. This is how the Acts of the Apostles ends. Paul is in the heart of the Roman Empire, declaring the gospel openly with the full knowledge of the Roman government. The victory."
So let's take a step back. Remember, he was under arrest for 2 years in Caesarea, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so then it took him like months to get to Rome because he got shipwrecked and a few other things. Now he's there 2 more years. So for the last 4 to 5 years of his life, he's been, quote, under arrest. And like it says here, he still had a ministry going. As I keep telling you, if you remember anything about Paul, he took advantage of every situation that presented itself. Notice here, he said they probably converted all the guards. It's like, not like they could go anywhere, you know. It's not like they could wait and go to the next room, you know. So, you know, he's right there. He's probably, you know, preaching and writing his letters because he's probably dictating them to somebody. And so he was able to take care of the guards. Now, 2 years goes by. Acts does not tell you this. So would somebody like to read from section 10:3 to where it says Paul's ministry?
Okay, I will. Presumably, Paul would have had a hearing before Caesar at the end of this period. The possible results might be conviction and execution, conviction and much stricter confinement, exile from Rome, or Paul's accusers don't appear and his case is dismissed. Perhaps the significance of the 2 years of Acts 28:30 is that it is the statutory time that Paul's accusers have to bring their case before the emperor before the case is dismissed. We're not sure. At any rate, there seems to be a firm Christian tradition that Paul was released for a time before his final execution. I don't know how you say that. Elizabeth, writing about 300 AD, says, after pleading his cause, he is said to have been sent again upon the ministry of preaching. Jerome writes in 392 AD that at the end of his first imprisonment, Paul was dismissed by Nero that the gospel of Christ might be preached also in the West. I think Paul's release in 62 AD is likely. If, as Christian tradition holds, Paul is executed by Nero following the Great Fire in Rome, 64 AD, which we'll discuss in a moment, then Paul has at least 2 years unaccounted for, from 62 to 64 AD and perhaps more.
So, Paul gets so it's likely that Paul was released for the first time. Okay. Remember, there are a lot of other books that were written that are not part of what they call the canon, which means they're not in the Bible.
Okay.
And so all these experts have been studying what those books say. All right, so listen to, I'll read this part. Listen to what they think could have happened. It's on page 2 of 3 at the top there. To Paul after he is, let loose. And it says, what is Paul doing after his supposed release from prison in 62 AD? Here it gets pretty fuzzy since there are only hints in the New Testament and specifics in early Christian tradition are rather general and sometimes conflicting. One is ministry in Spain. Now, buried in his letters, he mentions a couple of times that he wanted to go to what we would now call Spain. He says, one tantalizing possibility is that Paul goes to Spain and preaches there in fulfillment of his wish expressed in Romans 15:24-28. Clement, Bishop of Rome in 88-99 AD said, after preaching in both the East and West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of the West and suffered martyrdom under the prefects, or given his testimony before the rulers, depending on how you translate that. The extreme limit of the West probably indicates Spain. There is evidence of early Christian work in Spain. This is also supported by the Muratorian Canon of 170 AD. The apocryphal Acts of Peter. This is one of those books that's out there that's not in the Bible. A Gnostic work dated about 180 AD provides some detail about St. Paul departing to Spain from the Roman harbor of Ostia. As capital of the Roman province in Spain, Tarragona would have been the most likely city for Paul's mission in Spain, and there are some late traditions in that city that support this scenario. Okay, what traditions generally means is somebody wrote something, they don't know if this person is credible or not, but it sounds good. Anyway, the other thing that could have happened is ministry around the Aegean Sea. The pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, seem to have been written after Paul's Roman imprisonment and offer some clues to Paul's activities. We're not sure of Paul's location when he writes 1st Timothy and Titus, although 2nd Timothy is written from prison in Rome toward the end of his life. Here are some snippets that suggest a ministry around the Aegean Sea. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so you may command certain men not to teach false doctrines any longer. You see what he's doing?
Yeah.
He's saying, hey, you stick around, make sure that nobody's doing this stuff in their worship. Although I hope to come and see you in Ephesus soon. Remember, he's telling Timothy to be in Ephesus. I am writing you these instructions so that if I am delayed, that's in 1 Timothy, The reason I left you in Crete is that you might straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. Now, again, you asked how these people, they learned to behave themselves. Well, they appointed elders. And these elders were given instructions as to what to do and what to not to do. Then he says, as soon as I send Artemis or Theoclius to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis, because I've decided to winter there. Okay? When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls, especially the parchments. That's in 2 Timothy. He's probably in prison then. Erastus stayed in Corinth, and I left Trophius sick in Miletus. Again, that's in 2 Timothy. Exactly where Paul goes and when is a mystery we cannot unravel. But it seems to me that probably Paul went to Spain and conducted a ministry in the Aegean area from about AD 62 or 64 or 65 AD. So he's gone to Rome. He has been released. We don't know where he went, but he went somewhere and did more teaching. What is also not known is how he ended up back in Rome the second time. But we know that in fact did happen. Because all it says is, when Paul dies, somewhere around 64 or 65 AD. This is after the Great Fire of Rome. Now remember, Nero was a little bit, had a few screws loose, let's put it that way, as most of the Roman emperors did. Caligula was not a Boy Scout by any stretch of the imagination. But Nero had a few screws loose, and if you read up on go into the internet, read up on his history, you'll understand why. He was involved in all kinds of strange things in the royal family and whatnot. No one knows what happened when Rome was set fire. Presumably it was just a natural thing, but Nero had to blame somebody because they were blaming him. So he blamed the Christians. Well, now Paul is back there, so now he didn't get the favorable treatment he got the first time. So Eusebius writes about Paul's death. After a second visit to the city, he finished his life with martyrdom. And then Jerome wrote, he then in the 14th year of Nero, on the same day with Peter, was beheaded at Rome in Christ's sake, and was buried on the Ostian Way, the 27th year of our Lord's Passion. Now his dating may have been a bit off, since Nero reigned from 54 to 68 AD, but the tradition of Rome being beheaded by order of Nero is sound. Now he also says he was killed with Peter. Peter was not a Roman citizen. Paul was. And because he was a Roman citizen, he got to choose the way he died. Peter didn't get a choice. Anybody remember what happened to him?
He's the one that got crucified upside down.
He got crucified upside down because he said he did not want to, he wanted to be below his Lord who was crucified right side up. So basically that's the story. So stop and think of what this guy was able to do. He went all kinds of different places, hundreds of miles, some by ship, some by camel, some walking, some by cart, who knows. Supported himself this whole time, committed himself to start churches. He started churches all over the known world that stayed on after he died. He found elders, he authorized them to watch over the churches, to correct them when they were wrong, to give them instruction as to how to do things. I mean, stop and think about this. That's pretty good for one lifetime. I mean, people today would have a hard time doing that with the modern conveniences. To give you an idea of how my mind works, I'm reminded of, you know who Michael Palin is?
Monty Python?
What's that?
Monty Python?
Now, Monty Python, yeah. Michael Palin got this idea that he was going to go around the world in 80 days, but he was only going to do it using transportation methods that were available during the time the book was written. So no cars, no planes. He had to do it with, and so he started on this thing, and he would send back videotapes of where he was at, and they would show it on this British television show, where he was at, and how he got there and everything. He had all kinds of trouble trying to find, transportation methods that dated back that far that were still useful. One of his biggest problems was how he got across the Pacific Ocean. Think about it, how many cruise ships do you know cross the Pacific Ocean? None I know of. So he had to take a job on board a container ship as a member of the crew in order to get across the Pacific Ocean. I mean, we don't think about this. Paul didn't even have that much to go on. Remember it said last week he was shipwrecked 3 times? I mean, this is one committed dude. And all of his letters were not collected until after he died, which explains why the book of Acts doesn't mention them. Now, Luke recorded all the places that they went together and that he knew of, but the book of Acts stops when he's in Rome the first time and doesn't say another word about it. So all we have to go on are all those references he puts in his letters. So all these scholars did is lined up these letters based on what order they thought they were in, and tried it back to the book of Acts and see which ones connected and which ones didn't. And they also had to go through all kinds of checks to make sure that the letters that were written supposedly by Paul were written by the same dictation. In other words, the same use of sentence structure, the same use of verbs, and all that other kind of thing. And so far, they know for sure that at least seven of them are. At least 7 of them are. And so that gives you an idea of what Paul's ministry was all about. Think about this. When this guy was in his 20s, the farthest thing that he wanted to do was what he ended up doing. Isn't that amazing? Just for fun, let's see how the tape ends and glorifies him. But you can imagine all of those places that you saw on the tape, all of those different locations, all of those different views of the world, and how they went from people that were Greek and Roman, and then remember the people in Malta, they called them barbarians, and he ministered to them all. He didn't care. How many of the jailers and the people that were persecuting him did he minister to, and how many of them he actually converted to Christ? That's a little bit scary. Come on, play. See, that's supposedly how he was beheaded.
Paul was lifted up by a woman and carried to her personal burial crypt. Her name was Lucina, and his tomb was found with his name on it under the reign of Constantine. And from it sprang St. Paul's outside the walls. Paul knew that if he would arrive in Rome, his message would go out in every direction, just like the Roman highways. And it did.
And now for the closing credits, I want you. Boy, these scholars, I wish I could have been one of those scholars. California, Florida. So you can see what it took to put this together. But look at that If you got a small boat, you know, with no hull, didn't bounce around like this, and that's the way Paul chose to travel.
No compass,
What's that?
no compass?
Well, they had compasses, but they weren't real good. they did it by the height of the sun and at the and they probably had something that my guess is that they had something that would have been something like a sextant. That'd be my guess. But anyway, if you look at a map, remember we talked last week about how he was going to Rome and ended up in Malta? If you look where Malta is, Malta means they were way off course. They were so far west of Rome, it was almost impossible for, if they hadn't found Malta, they were gonna die. Because, Rome is here, and they went all the way over here, and then had to go all the way back. So, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of Paul. Paul was an interesting character for many ways. Like I say, sometimes he's bad-mouthed for some of the things he did, but at the same time, if it wasn't for him, then chances are we wouldn't be here, because he had the ability to deal with the Gentiles because he grew up as a Roman citizen, which means he understood the Roman world. And people have a tendency to forget that. Now, the other thing that you have to ask yourself is, people say that Jesus isn't alive. Well, what else could have caused Paul to change his life like that, to do what we saw him do? I mean, he didn't get hit in the head with a brick or something. Something happened to change that man's view of the world. And it had to be something awful powerful. And he mentions it probably 6 or 7 times. And what he should have done is just recorded it every time he went before a court. Here's my story, plug it in. Because he has to say it over and over and over and over again. And the other point you have to understand is that some of these people were very, very upset at who he was and what he was about. Like Dave, you said, how do you, and Leonie, you said, how do you behave in church? Well, keep this in mind. He's tossing out any rule they thought they had. Any woman they thought they had. I mean, any woman that thought the new faith was great, because before they were nobodies, and in many cases they weren't even allowed in the synagogue. Okay, so remember, it's 10 married Jewish men. They didn't say anything about the women, just the men. So this new faith was fantastic to them. The slaves thought this was great because, as far as Paul was concerned, they were equal to everybody else. Think about that. In the early world, slavery was very common. Okay, very common. And in fact, just about everybody who lived in Rome had them. And that's one of the reasons why the Roman Empire fell apart, by the way, because they stopped working. Because everybody was doing the work for them for so long, they forgot how. So stop and think about that. This was a new idea at a time when there were no rules. And Paul had to establish what those rules were in the churches that he founded. Now, to be honest with you, there was also other ministers running around, like Peter, for instance. And there's also John, who wrote the fourth gospel, and some of the other disciples had gone to other parts of the world that were doing the same thing. But it just so happened that Paul was the best at it, and Luke followed Paul. He also inspired John Mark, who wrote a gospel. Luke wrote a gospel. Luke wrote Acts of the Apostles. All the other elders that they mentioned either knew him or knew of him. So this guy must have been something else. Best way I can describe him right now is Billy Graham with an attitude. I mean, think about that. Billy Graham with an attitude.
Now,
Now,
when he established his church by the letters that he sent out to the churches, how it should work and
Right.
stuff, according to him.
mhm.
It didn't take us long to get away from that by all the different denominations that are interpreting his
Precisely.
his letters.
And part of that has to do with the fact that, remember, until the Protestant Reformation, there was technically only one church, possibly two, because you had the Eastern Orthodox. But there was only those two churches in the whole world that anybody knew about. Okay, those churches were handled by brothers and priests and whatever that went to, they were the only learned people around. I mean, it was called the Dark Ages for a reason. So the only learned people supposedly were the church people. Everybody else was peasants, so it got to the point where the peasants listened to the learned people. And since they were all men, they looked at it from a man's point of view. And so here comes Martin Luther along, and we're going to talk about that in our sermon today about militancy. He decides that, hey, this ain't right, and he puts up the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. Naturally, everybody said, these are all great, and you're a nice guy. He had to be like Paul. He had to get out of town. And the only reason he survived is because he found some duke somewhere in Germany that gave him asylum and protected him inside his castle. But it was from there that the reformers started going in different directions, and they didn't agree with each other. For example, Zwingli believed that there should be no stained glass or statues anywhere in the sanctuary because it's distracting. So whenever a cathedral got converted to follow him, they would throw the statues out in the street and break all the windows.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I always wondered, I hope this not sound too judgmental, but like the statues, it seems kind of like idolatrous.
No,
Like
it's
why
not.
would you?
No, it's not.
Well, basically what the statues were for.
And that's an opening for discussion, not
No,
a
it's
reflexive no.
No, what those statues were there for. Remember, in the Catholic Church, the belief was that you had intervention by saints. And so what you had the statues there to, that you prayed to these saints to intervene on your behalf. That was what you did. So you remember, each patron saint is a patron saint of something. So if, for example, Tom O'Brien, who we know real well, would tell the story about how he chose his confirmation name. He grew up Catholic. He was actually going to be a priest. And his confirmation name was Jude. And he said, the confirmation name I wanted was Francis. Because he, St. Francis of Assisi was his, favorite saint growing up. And his mother told him, no, you're going to be Jude. Why? Because Jude was the patron saint of hopeless causes, and his mother was having trouble having children, so she was praying to Saint Jude to intervene for her. And that's what you did. There was each one of these saints, and you had to find which one to pray to. So they would have statues of them in these big cathedrals so that people would know who they were praying to. Now, we don't believe that there's an intervention, and that's one of the reasons why Zwingli had it wasn't considered, because Zwingli kind of believed half of what you just said, that these were unnecessary impediments between yourself and God. That's what he believed. So that's why he got rid of them. Now Calvin was a little more lenient. Okay, Calvin, who we follow, first of all, Zwingli did not believe in music. Music was distracting. Calvin didn't agree. Calvin thought music was great. So one of the first things that Calvin did was write what we call the Psalter. Now the church he used to work for actually had a Psalter and used it. The Psalter was like the original hymn book, and all the psalms had been translated into music. In fact, the blue hymnals in there, in the center is the remnants of the Psalter. So that was their music, and in fact, Calvin hired some people to actually write these things. So you had Zwingli's no music at all. Calvin thought music was okay. Martin Luther felt that the word was the most important thing. Calvin said the word is important, but you have to have all these other things going on around it. So eventually everybody started going in different directions. And that's where that began. One of the things we can do is we can study the history of the church. The Presbyterian Church is an interesting history. I mean, there's been more schisms and fights and offshoots and everything else. It's amazing that there's a map that shows them all. It's just incredible, how many times the Presbyterian Church has split this way and merged that way and gone that way and done this. There are a lot of, so each of these faiths has a different view of worship, and that's how it started. As I said, we ordain women as ministers and elders in our denomination. The Baptists would never think of such a thing. And also the Presbyterian Church in America doesn't ordain them either. But the PCUSA does. Then again, some of the Baptist churches, especially in the inner city, will ordain 13-year-olds. I mean, so you haven't seen that?
I guess if you feel you have the gift.
Yeah, you'll see it very once in a while. A 13-year-old up there preaching, and he's a minister because he's got the gift. All denominations do things a little bit differently, and one of the things that Paul points out, and if I can find it real quick, then I've got a little evaluation for you to fill out, so I'll know what to do next time. But let's see, 4:18 to 20. Paul, this book comes up with an interesting way of looking at the world. Let's see, that's not that one. Basically, I'll just paraphrase it. Basically, what Paul would have told you is that the church is not a club you join and leave. In his view, that wasn't the case at all. The church was a body that does God's work. And the way we have to look at it is somehow if some denomination somewhere can attract people to do God's work, then it's doing its job. There really can't be any right way to do it, because if there was, why would there be? You know how many denominations were listed in Cleveland alone in 1995? 70.
Denominations within Presbyterianism?
No, there's just denominations, period.
Oh,
Different, church denominations, 70 of them that were Christian.
I thought it would be more.
Yeah, and so, so it's amazing how many different ways you can see the faith. But what Paul was trying to do is he was trying to let people feel their way along, and then when he had to, he would write a letter saying, this is what you have to do to straighten out. One of the things that we studied was 2 Thessalonians. The whole letter was about the fact that, believe it or not, the entire church had stopped working. They were sitting on their front porch waiting for Christ to come, because they figured the second coming was imminent and they wanted to be there when it happened. So Paul had to write a letter saying, no, that doesn't work that way. Jesus said it will come like a thief in the night. You're not supposed to be out there waiting for this to happen. You're supposed to be, doing, God's work and doing the work of the